So we're in week 8 and looking at the second part of leading, which is leading teams and looking at compositions of teams. To share his views, knowledge and experience on the topic, we have Dr. Liam Lenton, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at the Literal Business School. Now, just to give a bit of background about Liam, his research has centered more on sports economics, specifically rules, regulation, incentives, and athlete behavior, with an emphasis on various forms of cheating. What better way to look at the concept of teams and leading teams than how things happen in sporting teams? Welcome, Liam.
Thanks for inviting me, Shalinka.
On to our first question. What are the sport teams that you have noticed in terms of their teamwork?
Oh, that's a difficult one to open with, but I guess that throughout the years, and I must note for the audience sake that these days I find myself not really following pro sports anywhere nearly as closely as I did in my younger days. But back when I did, I would always take note of certain teams, certain clubs in certain sports that have a reputation for developing models of teamwork that seem to consistently outperform all of their competitors. And in, let's say, the round ball version of football, so let's say for the rest of this interview, whenever I say football, that's the brand of football I'm talking about. Historically, a Dutch team by the name of Ajax Amsterdam have always had a reputation. They were one of the first to pioneer this concept of a youth academy, where they get kids that are as young as 5 years old and bringing them up in the club's philosophy from the get-go. And for a long time in these academies, they play forms of the game that don't even involve goals or scoring, right? Because the idea is to get them educated in the fundamentals of the game before they then proceed to other elements of the sport, such as competing against the other team. So part of that initial education is to teach them some of these fundamentals about teamwork, knowing in set play situations where your teammates are going to be around you, so that when you get a pass from this angle, you know player X is going to be there, you know that that's one option, player Y is going to be over there, there's another option, and then when you do Z, then someone else does W, and the idea is that the opposition team can't get to work this out, and you'll have an advantage over them. Likewise, for the local audience, certain coaches in Australian rules football have a reputation for being able to develop models of teamwork that consistently outperform other teams. So among this, John Longmire of the Sydney Swans, Alastair Clarkson at Hawthorn, and that there are certain individuals and certainly I think that translates across sports as well. It's not just in Australian rules football, but certain coaches in every sport have a reputation for just having that nous at building a team culture that consistently outperforms their competitors.
Interesting. So what I hear is that it's not just competing against another team to win something. It's about getting the team ready for that final goal of winning something. So in terms of, if I sort of apply this into an organizational point of view, we are looking at, forming and norming teams into getting to that organizational goal.
Yeah, well, there are parallels there. So I guess what I've discussed so far is talking about tactics,
yeah.
but much of this stuff is done long before the game actually commences, right? So these coaches and organisations that have that reputation for building superior models of team performance are those that also have the advantage in preparation of the team, development of tactics, drilling the tactics into the players, having more efficient modes of practicing before set plays and so on before the game actually commences, so that by the time that the X number of individuals walk out through the race onto the field, they're already at a substantial advantage to the other team if they're able to pull all this stuff off effectively.
True. My second question is, do you think skills are used in team sports are complements or substitutes?
Well, it's a really good question. The short answer is it depends on the sport. Obviously, the nomenclature in team sport, we talk about team sports, right, as opposed to groups. And I noticed that one of the key themes of your lecture in this particular week is distinguishing between teams and groups, right, defining characteristics one between the other. But in obviously in economics, where we talk about complements and substitutes with respect to different types of goods and services, right? But it can also be applied in an organisational setting. I would tend to think of certain sports like football, again, or rugby as being sports whereby the roles played by the different members of the team are more towards the complements end of the spectrum. So you'll usually notice that you might have one standout player every few years, or maybe even generation, like a Jonah Lomu or a Lionel Messi, who can just basically do the whole thing on their own. But that's very, very rare. A lot of the great teams are ones where it's well drilled into all of the players what their role is, what the tactics are, and you beat the opposition teams by more effective teamwork. So in that case, the word team definitely applies more. But then you could go to other situations in sport where it's more towards the other end of the spectrum, where it's more groups, really, even though they're still called teams. Probably the best example I could think of would be, let's say, Davis Cup, which is kind of the team version of tennis, whereby, I know the format's changed recently, but the traditional format was that you would have a total of 5 rubbers. And if, let's say, I'm a singles player representing Australia and I play 2 separate singles matches, well, my part of the production in trying to win that tie is completely independent of what the other players representing Australia are able to do in it, other than the doubles match, yeah? So that's very much towards the other end of the spectrum. You might call it a group, even though, as I said, the lingo is still that we call it a team. And then other situations or other sports like perhaps cricket or baseball, it'd probably be somewhere in the middle. There are some roles that are highly substitutable. So that is that, in cricket, bowlers tend not to be able to bat that well. And even going further in baseball, you generally have one main pitcher and then a relieving pitcher, and similarly there are rules that differ in so far as whether the pitcher has to bat or not. So that they'd be characterised as being somewhere in the middle. But like, a great question, and I guess I'll come back to my headline answer that I said at the beginning. It very much depends on the frame of reference, and obviously in general organisational behaviour, that's a really good lesson to learn, because obviously the same would apply very much in one organisational setting to another, and within an organisation, maybe even from one department or work unit to another. So you can have all sorts of situational settings where it's very much a group, or very much a team, or very much smack bang in the middle.
Interesting. So we've been talking about the team dynamics, and one of the things about team dynamics is the leadership of the teams. Can you elaborate on how team leaders contribute to the success of a team, or even the fall of a team if it's bad leadership?
Yeah. Uh, in pro sport, you tend to have these teams that are put together. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. In light of current events, obviously, all of a sudden everyone's making this stuff up on the fly. But generally, recruiting is done for the following season months in advance. Again, depending on the sport or the league. And then these teams of individuals are given time to become more cohesive and so on. So put a team out on the park and they'll be able to do something, right? But the accepted wisdom is that on top of that, you have a very strong leader that can still improve those outcomes. And just like with the situation when I talked about how some coaches in certain sports have a reputation for being able to develop more efficient modes of teamwork, the true is also that generally when it comes to talking about leaders, whether it's the captain or the coach or the coaching staff more broadly, or even a leadership group. One thing that I've noticed in following Australian rules football, or the AFL, in the last generation or so, is that whereas once upon a time you typically have a captain of a team, and an Aussie rules team is 18 players plus these days up to 4 interchange players, so one leader of 22, and then maybe a vice captain, perhaps a deputy vice captain. Well, these days, it's very much a mixed bag, looking at the 18 teams across the competition as to what the mode of the leadership group looks like. So some teams typically, I think this is still probably more common than any other single mode, will have the one single captain, but it's certainly not uncommon to have 2 co-captains. And in fact, the most extreme example I can remember was the Brisbane Lions back in about 2007, 2008, actually having 5 co-captains at one particular point.
Wow.
And then below that, there have been cases where you have 3 or 4 joint vice-captains underneath the one captain. Other cases where you might have a more informal leadership group of, let's say, even 6 or 8 or even 10 players. So these days, as individual organisations, different teams go for their own leadership group or structure. And I think that they also tend to allow, they do an investigation of the playing stocks and the leadership chops that they have within that group, and often make those decisions on the structure based on what they know they've got in the kit bag. So that's one real trend that I've noticed lately. But certainly one thing is as true today in pro sport as it was in the early days of professional sport many, many decades ago, and that is that, yes, if you have really good, strong leadership with some tactical nous, that can obviously improve outcomes on comparative to what you would have if all other things are equal, but you don't have that strong leadership at your disposal.
I find that very interesting. So it's not just your immediate leadership, so like a team lead in a project. If we just apply that in an organizational sense, it could be the director, board of directors, or the group of leadership that you have to look at it, because they all influence as to how the team functions and team reaches their goal. Yeah,
well, I did mention before when talking about teams in the AFL that have been very successful in the last decade, and I mentioned John Longmire and Alistair Clarkson as head coaches. But when you go further than that and look at how AFL teams like the Sydney Swans and Hawthorn and even Geelong are run professionally, the more anecdotes I hear about this, the more it seems to me that from the presidents of the club and the CEO right down to the to what they call the football department, that obviously makes a massive role as well, and makes the role of the head coach, who's supposed to only be looking after the playing side of the equation, makes their role a lot easier as well.
Fantastic. When I was reading about your profile, I was very interested in the research that you're doing. So I want to ask this last question based on that. How does your research relate to the themes of teamwork and leadership?
Look, I can't claim that I've been researching anything as really directly related to what we've been discussing, which is more, I guess, related to the classic textbook material that you'd find in introductory organisational behaviour or thereabouts. But yeah, I can say that I've been engaged in certain projects that kind of look at a very specific element of leadership or teamwork or organisational behaviour. One project I've got at the moment looks at data from the AFL and looks at a player rating mechanism, which any AFL fans watching this will know as the Brownlow Medal. So this is the best player award within the league. And what I wanted to do was look at the role of being assigned or allocated as a leader, whether you're a captain or let's say a co-captain or a vice captain or a deputy vice captain, and to create a hierarchy of these leadership roles and see how that might affect voting. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to do this was because I was rather curious as to whether the output of an individual within an organisational setting that person might be given an artificially high rating just because they're a leader, and there's a halo effect around them that in reality, the reality doesn't quite match that. I'll leave aside the reasons why I was interested in this, but the basic premise was that I built this hierarchy of leadership roles within AFL teams, and then obviously we can observe for, let's say, the last 30 years or so what the Brownlow Medal votes were within a given match. I have access to data that looks at each player's what we call match statistics throughout a match. So the number of kicks that they got, the number of marks, the number of handballs, number of goals and so on, all of their productive actions. And so we'll control for these, and then hopefully when we remove all of that actual performance out of it, that'll allow us to observe whether umpires are still... and that's the key setting here, is that the stakeholder group that's giving the votes is external to the firms that are competing, right? So in a generic organisational setting, lots of companies know that if they have their own internal process for evaluating employees, that it is potentially subject to biases because you've got natural human relations and so on. Person A may get the rub of the green from the boss because they're kind of friends with them, rather comparative, he got the promotion when I didn't, and that sort of thing. And so a lot of companies use external consultants, like human resource consultants, to undertake that process for them because they believe that'll eliminate biases. Sounds plausible enough, but it still remains an empirical question, right? Definitely. Now, if I went to top 200 companies and asked them to give me their employee evaluation records, I don't expect to get a lot of love, right? Yes. So the nice thing about, for me, with sports research is that when it comes to a setting like this, that obviously it can't... we get a certain result. It can't tell us about this generally with absolute guarantees, but at least it does offer us some evidence, whereas we can't get our hands on the data to begin with if we want to do it more generally. And fortunately for me, there are lots of people out there who have nothing better to do with their time but to dump vast arrays of data onto the web, and that makes my job easy. I just acquire it and then use it to run these tests. So anyway, what I found was a nice hierarchy. In fact, sole captains of teams tend to get more votes from the umpires, even when you control for the fact that captains tend to be among the better players within the team to begin with, and that's part of the process that led to them being allocated to be captain in the first place. So when you control for this, yes, they still end up getting more votes. And there ends up being a nice hierarchy in the results. By the time you get down to a player where they were captain for a particular match, but they normally have no leadership role. They were only captain in that match because, let's say, the normal captain was injured, the vice captain was suspended, and the deputy vice captain was ill and missed the game. So, they're it all of a sudden. So in that situation, there's no significant difference, right? So that's kind of the bottom end of that hierarchy, and it doesn't make a difference. But at the top end, it makes a difference, and our interpretation on that result is that it may also be due to the fact that relative to all the other players, the leaders, in particular the captain, has extra contact with the umpires that the others don't. So, for example, the captains will tend to congregate in the middle of the ground before the game for the coin toss to decide who or which team kicks which way in the first quarter. And that involves, a handshake, which we can't do at the moment, and then a bit of extra discussion. And typically during the course of a match, captains will tend to have more interaction with the umpires than most other players. And in fact, in rugby, there's a convention that only the captain can speak to the referee without being spoken to first. Right. So in other sports it may differ, but certainly that's our evidence, and it's not directly related to your other questions, but it does give some of our viewers here a little bit of background and insight as to why I'm interested in these sorts of issues that you're discussing in your lecture this week.
Look, I think the whole idea of our interview series is that to get the students to understand, going beyond the theory, how all of this works into whether it's sporting teams or organizations or whatever it is. And certainly that research and its findings are very, very interesting. It's definitely been a very interesting conversation. I've obviously learned a lot about a few things because obviously I'm not native Australian in the sense I migrated. So it was definitely interesting, and I'm sure our students who are watching this will also find this interesting and understand a little bit beyond what they read from their book chapter.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things I love best about this research kind of area is that hopefully some of your students will get the sense that if they like sport and they watch it, that there are general lessons to be learnt about what you're learning here at university that you can think about while you're watching sport. And if you don't watch much sport and you don't really like it, that's fine. Most people who don't still tend to understand what it is and how there are lessons that can be applied to the classroom. So I guess that'd be one of my main messages for your students is that it's easy to apply something like sport, and even if it's not sport that you don't like, that maybe music, pop music, or something else that you're into as a hobby. There are often plenty of parallels and plenty of lessons that can be drawn towards the classroom material and can enhance your learning.
Yeah, there's always something to learn in everything that we observe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Liam, for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with our students and spending this time with us. Thank you.
Pleasure, Shalinga.